So it wouldn't serve the waiting list, and I'm not sure how they're going to get that by the federal government, but I guess that's something that was a bridge they were going to cross, I guess, when they got there. And then finally, and this is what really got my attention, being a former budget person myself, is that the original bill started out and would allow the managed care organization to take 15% off the top for administration and profit. Now, I want you to compare that to what our administrative and our overhead for operating the waiver is 4%. So that's more than triple. It's more than triple. We pointed that out to everyone who would listen. And there was an amendment to the bill later that dropped that down to 8%. So the good news is that's 7% less that they would take out of funding for services. The bad news is that's still double what we currently incur. Arizona, for instance, which is another managed care state, operates at about a little more than we do. I think they mentioned about 6%. So we're really concerned with that, what is called a medical loss ratio. For those of you who are going to follow this issue, that medical loss ratio, I believe, is very important. And again, you have to ask yourself, is it necessary to spend that kind of administrative overhead to manage the types of services that we're providing? Again, we're not managing cardiac patients. We're not managing diabetes or other chronic medical conditions. The services that we provide are very common sense. If you're quadriplegic, if someone doesn't help you, you're not going to get out of bed in the morning. I don't know that you really need to pay a managed care organization $150 million, which is about what 15% would be. I don't really know that you need to pay that kind of money to tell a person who is limited in their mobility that they're going to need a personal care assistant in order to go to work every day. So these are some thoughts. Now let me tell you a little bit. Of course, I've done a little research on this and talked to some of my colleagues in other states where they have managed care programs. And one thing that I do want to mention is that the approach in this bill was very unique and very different. Very different from what we're seeing in other states. In other states where they have statewide managed care, you're usually seeing that managed care organization, at least for home and community-based services, is usually being managed by a public entity. In Arizona, it is the state DD agency. It's their version of APD. In Michigan, it's essentially their version of APD, but they are highly dependent on local government so that the actual managing entities are components of local governments or a coalition of local governments, but they're primarily public entities, not private sector entities that are managing the care. The Arizona system is probably the most well-established and long-standing system. In the Arizona system, if you were to go to Arizona and you were being served by that system, you would not be able to tell a whole lot of difference between how they operate and how we operate. With two really major exceptions. One that you would experience firsthand, the other that would be more of an issue that those of us managing the program would notice. First off is that the waiver support coordinators in the Arizona system, again, the DD agency in Arizona is the managed care entity. All of the case managers work for the state of Arizona, or the Arizona DD agency. So again, the family or the consumer doesn't select and hire and fire. The support coordinator is the state. Now, one of the advantages that you would notice with that arrangement is that as state employees, those support coordinators have upfront authority to authorize certain services so that if it is a normal, routine type of service for your circumstance, you don't go through a PSA process. That support coordinator has the authority to do that. You only move into a prior service authorization type of process when it's outside of certain norms. The other big difference with Arizona is that they're funded based on a capitated rate methodology which looks at the population and basically has, they have come up with a very sophisticated risk profile so that for a person with with Down syndrome who is 32 years old, they fall in a certain risk corridor, and they are funded based on their demographics, past history, projected forward. They periodically readjust provider rates. They take all newcomers. So in that respect, the funding that is established by the legislature is actually based on history. That would be a welcome change here in Florida. Because as it is, our budget gets reduced, and then we're called on the carpet when we run a deficit. So there are some parts of this. What I'm trying to communicate to you all is that there are things that could be very, very positive about this if it's done right. Like most things, the devil's in the details. And that's why you need to engage and communicate with policymakers on this. Now, the downside from the policymaker's perspective is that the Arizona system is much more expensive. Like I said before, it costs the Arizona taxpayer a lot more per taxpayer than our system today costs Florida taxpayers. It has had average cost increases over the last, I'm drawing a blank now on how long I looked at this. I think I went back 6 years. The average cost increase of that system has been around 11% per year. Now again, in contrast, we're back to roughly 2006-07 spending as of the last fiscal year. So it's a more expensive program, but there are certain advantages to it. And that's certainly something that that we could work with the legislature to try to set something like that up here in Florida. But there is a fiscal reality if you're going to do that kind of a system. Finally, let me talk a little bit about our I-budget. Because all of these pressures that I went over before, the increase in cost, the economic problems, the perception that things were out of control, all of these things were what led me to want to find solutions. Because I knew this conversation was going to reappear. In fact, the four-tiered waiver system came about after the House failed to pass a managed care bill back in the, I believe, the 2007 session. One of the most amazing things I've ever seen. A bill died in committee, or would have died. They didn't take the vote. And so it was replaced with the four-tiered waiver system. So it was pretty easy. You didn't have to be a prophet. You didn't have to have a crystal ball or read palms to know that this was going to come back up, because all of the factors that were driving the discussion continue to be issues today. And they were issues back then. So the last thing in the world that we wanted was to have these issues come up and for us as a community to not have at least had a discussion as to what are some alternatives that might work for us. To engage our community rather than our community reacting to something that was developed in the halls of the Capitol. And that's why we embarked on this I-budget. That's why I personally went from Pensacola down to Miami, then back again. I did that twice. Explaining, getting your input to develop a plan, and then explaining to you all what that plan was once it's developed. That's why I convened a group of 17 stakeholders that were family members, including family care council members, independent support coordinators, agency support coordinators, Florida ARC, Florida ARF, the providers. We had every conceivable interest represented at that table, and they developed the plan. I felt it was important that as a community, we show the policymakers we can be proactive. We're not going to stick our head in the sand, let the world pass us by, and then play defense again. We're going to be able to play a little bit of offense. So our budget was developed understanding that some kind of change was going to probably be bound to happen. And fortunately, today, it is the law of the land. It passed. We were told to implement it. We were told to implement it statewide. Now, we are starting off, we're going to phase it in. We're phasing it in the Tallahassee area. A number of reasons why we feel that's smart. Number one is Tallahassee is big enough to give us a legitimate test, but it's small enough that we can discover problems and correct them before we have something like we had when we tried to just flip the switch on the 4 tiers, all on the same day. It's not an experience I want you all to have, certainly not.